For more than 60 years, one of the most beautiful places in all of North America has been sitting silently at the bottom of a lake, drowned, hidden, and unseen. It was a vast labyrinth of glowing red sandstone canyons, hung with ferns and waterfalls, carved by the Colorado River over the course of millions of years. And in the 1960s, it was flooded, vanished beneath the slowly rising waters of an enormous reservoir called Lake Powell. Most people alive on Earth today have never once laid eyes on it. They know it only from a small handful of old, faded photographs. But now, something genuinely extraordinary is happening. The lake is shrinking. The water is pulling back. And out of the depths, inch by inch, a lost canyon is rising once more into the light. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. This is a very different kind of story about the Colorado River. You have very likely heard the crisis version of it by now, the shrinking reservoirs, the water running dangerously low, the looming shortages hanging over an entire region, and all of that is completely real. But there is another story quietly unfolding beneath the surface of Lake Powell, quite literally beneath it. And it is one of the most remarkable and most genuinely bittersweet environmental stories anywhere in America right now. It is the story of a lost canyon slowly coming back to life, and of a fierce and still entirely unresolved debate about whether or not we should let it. To understand any of it, you first have to go back and understand what was actually there before the lake ever existed. It was called Glen Canyon, a vast, winding, intricate system of deep red rock canyons running along the Colorado River, right on the border between Utah and Arizona. And by every account of the very few people who ever actually saw it, it was almost unbearably, achingly beautiful. It was not the sheer, dramatic, dizzying cliffs of the nearby Grand Canyon. It was something altogether gentler and quieter and far more intimate. Mile after mile after mile of softly glowing sandstone, sculpted by wind and water into smooth, flowing curves and secret hidden alcoves. There were cool, shaded, fern-draped grottos. There were hanging gardens of wildflowers spilling down the damp walls. There were clear, trickling streams and graceful natural stone arches and bridges. And woven all through it were the traces of the ancient peoples who had lived in those canyons for thousands of years, their rock art, their cliff dwellings, and countless places held sacred by the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Paiute, and the Ute nations. And the single most famous of all of its many hidden wonders was a soaring, cathedral-like chamber of stone, with a delicate waterfall spilling down into its heart, a place so serene and so quietly grand that it was given the perfect name, the Cathedral in the Desert. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, before today, had you ever even heard of Glen Canyon or of this hidden cathedral beneath the lake? Let me know down in the comments. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. But in the early 1960s, all of it, every canyon, every grotto, every arch, was deliberately sacrificed. The U.S. government built the Glen Canyon Dam, an enormous wall of concrete thrown straight across the Colorado River, in order to store water and generate electricity for the rapidly growing American Southwest. And as the Great Dam was sealed shut, the river began to back up behind it, and the water slowly, steadily started to rise. Over the better part of 2 full decades, Glen Canyon quietly filled and drowned. 186 miles of the main river channel and more than 125 separate side canyons all vanished beneath the surface of a vast new reservoir, Lake Powell. The cathedral in the desert disappeared under nearly 100 feet of still water, and most of Glen Canyon's staggering beauty was lost to the world before the wider world had ever even known that it was there in the first place. It became one of the single, most mourned environmental losses in all of American history. The very man who had reluctantly agreed not to fight the building of the dam, the head of the Sierra Club, a passionate conservationist named David Brower, was so utterly haunted by what had been lost when he finally saw the canyon for himself that he came to call it the single greatest mistake of his entire life. He would spend the rest of his years fighting other dams on other rivers, so that no other place would ever have to suffer the very same fate. and Glen Canyon itself became a kind of ghost, a lost world, remembered only in a few old photographs, and quietly grieved by the handful of people who had been lucky enough to know it. And that grief, it turns out, changed history. Because the loss of Glen Canyon did not just haunt one man. It helped to ignite the entire modern environmental movement in America. The bitter lesson of the drowned canyon, the sense that something irreplaceable had been destroyed almost carelessly before anyone even understood its value, gave conservationists a new fierceness. And just a few years later, when the government proposed building not one but two more enormous dams that would have flooded parts of the Grand Canyon itself, that hardened resolve helped win the fight. The Grand Canyon was saved, in no small part, because of the guilt and the anguish over what had already been lost, forever, just upstream in Glen Canyon. In a strange and painful way, the drowning of one great canyon may have spared another. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this story as fascinating and as moving as I do, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows, and if it's been worth your time so far. A quick like really does help the next person find it too. And for 60 long years, that was simply the end of the story. Until, quite recently, the water started to disappear. Because, as you may already know, the Colorado River is now caught in the grip of a long and punishing drought, one made steadily worse by a warming climate and by the simple, brutal fact that far too much of the river's water has been promised away to too many people. And so Lake Powell has been shrinking. And not gently, but dramatically. From around the year 2019 onward, the reservoir began a steep and alarming decline, and by the spring of 2023, it had fallen all the way to a record low, sitting some 180 feet below its full level, and holding only about a quarter of all the water it had originally been built to store. And it is worth pausing on just how enormous that shrinkage really is, because Lake Powell is no small pond. It is the second largest reservoir in the entire United States, held back by a dam more than 700 feet tall, and at full capacity, it stretches back nearly 200 miles through the canyon country. So when the water drops by 180 vertical feet, it does not simply expose a thin ring of muddy shoreline. It uncovers vast stretches of landscape, mile after mile of canyon that had been submerged, hidden bays and side channels reopening, entire drowned valleys draining back out into the air. The scale of what has reemerged is measured not in acres, but in tens of thousands of them, an area of returning wilderness large enough to be its own national park. And as the water pulled back, Glen Canyon began, slowly and miraculously, to return. Something on the order of 100,000 acres of the long-drowned canyon have now re-emerged, blinking back into the open air and the sunlight. Side canyons that had been buried beneath the reservoir for half a century saw daylight once again. The Colorado River itself, suddenly freed from the vast, still pool of the reservoir, began to flow and to run through the upper canyon once more, and its long-silenced rapids slowly reawakened, the rushing water scouring away decades of accumulated reservoir mud and sediment as it went. And most poignantly of all, the cathedral in the desert rose back up out of the depths. Its full stone chamber revealed to the sky, its 60-foot waterfall spilling down the entire length of the alcove once again, for the very first time in generations. And here is the truly astonishing part of it all. The canyon did not come back as some dead, gray, muddy wasteland. It came back to life. Almost the very instant that the water retreated, the native plants returned, delicate maidenhair ferns unfurling once more on the damp, seeping walls, cottonwood trees and willows and grasses, taking fresh root in the newly exposed sediment. The seasonal monsoon floods came rushing through the canyons and scoured their floors clean, sweeping out the last of the reservoir muck, and, in many places, revealing the smooth, sculpted stone underneath almost exactly as it had looked before the flooding ever began. Long-lost cultural sites and sacred places of the region's native peoples quietly emerged again into the light. With absolutely no help from anyone at all, simply given the smallest chance to do so, Glen Canyon had begun, all on its own, to heal itself. The scientists and the river advocates who have hiked deep into the returning canyons, now describe what they are seeing as one of the single largest natural restorations ever witnessed anywhere on the river, an entire lost world, quietly resurrecting itself from the dead. To walk into these canyons now is to walk through a genuine act of resurrection. River guides and researchers describe hiking and camping in places that were sitting under 100 feet of water just 2 or 3 years before, pitching a tent on a sandbar that was recently a lake bottom, or wandering up a side canyon whose walls are already exploding with green life. Great stone features that had been swallowed whole are reappearing, soaring natural bridges, hidden grottos, whole stretches of the Escalante arm of the canyon that had not been seen since before the flood. And in place after place, the returning river has done in a few short seasons what might have seemed to take centuries, flushing out the mud, recarving the channel, and coaxing the desert back to life. And there is a deeper and more human layer to what is resurfacing too, because Glen Canyon was never empty land. For thousands of years, it was home to native peoples. And it remains a landscape woven through with places sacred to the Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, Paiute, Ute, and other nations. When the reservoir flooded the canyon, it drowned countless of those cultural and ancestral sites beneath the water. And now, as the lake retreats, some of them are emerging back into the daylight for the first time in 60 years. A return that carries profound meaning for the tribes with ancestral ties to this land, even as it raises real and difficult new questions about how such fragile and irreplaceable places can now be properly protected. And it is right here that this story becomes a genuine and a surprisingly fierce debate, because, for a certain passionate group of people, the return of Glen Canyon is not merely a happy accident of the drought, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They look at the steadily reviving canyon, and they ask a genuinely radical question. What if we simply did not refill it? What if we chose, deliberately, to let Lake Powell go? There is, in fact, a real and serious proposal along exactly these lines, one championed by a group known as the Glen Canyon Institute, and it goes by the name Mead First. And the core idea behind it is this. Instead of storing the river's water in 2 separate giant reservoirs, both sitting on the very same stretch of river, why not drain Lake Powell entirely and move all of its water downstream into Lake Mead, that other larger reservoir held back behind the Hoover Dam, which has plenty of room to accept it? Let the reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam finally empty out for good, and in doing so, allow Glen Canyon to fully and permanently return and let the Colorado River run wild and free through the heart of it once again. It would be, if it ever actually came to pass, the single largest river restoration project in the entire history of the world. And the advocates for this vision make some genuinely compelling arguments. For one thing, they point out Lake Powell is actually a remarkably wasteful place to try to store water in the first place. The reservoir sits within a vast basin of porous sandstone, and a significant amount of its water simply soaks directly into the surrounding rock and quietly seeps away, or else evaporates straight off the wide surface under the relentless desert sun. That is water being lost, year after year after year, that could potentially be saved by consolidating everything into a single deeper reservoir instead. And for another, they argue, with the river now so badly overstretched and depleted, there may simply not be enough water left to keep both of these enormous reservoirs meaningfully full anyway, so why not consolidate what remains and get a priceless national treasure back in the very same bargain? There is also, lurking behind it all, a longer and slower reality that the advocates point to: sediment. The Colorado River carries an immense load of silt and sand, and for 60 years, Lake Powell has been trapping all of it, dropping it to the reservoir bottom where the still water meets the incoming river. Bit by bit, decade by decade, that sediment is filling the reservoir in, slowly stealing away its storage capacity and building up in a growing delta behind the dam. It is happening gradually, over a very long timescale, but it is relentless, and it cannot be stopped. And it means that Lake Powell, in some sense, was always living on borrowed time, that a reservoir like this one cannot last forever, regardless of the drought. To the advocates, that is one more reason to consider letting the river and the sediment and the canyon simply return to their natural course. But the idea faces an absolutely enormous uphill battle, and the objections raised against it are serious and real and deserve a fair hearing. Because Lake Powell is very far from being just a scenic reservoir, it is a genuine linchpin of the entire water system of the American West. The Glen Canyon Dam generates a great deal of hydroelectric power, clean electricity relied upon by millions of people across the region. The reservoir also functions as a crucial kind of savings account. It exists, in large part, precisely so that the upstream states can reliably meet their legal obligation to deliver a set amount of water downstream to the states below them, and draining it entirely would upend a delicate and fiercely contested century-old legal balance between 7 different states and the nation of Mexico. And on top of all of that, Lake Powell sits at the center of a large and thriving recreation and tourism economy, hundreds of thousands of annual visitors and boaters, and the many towns and businesses that depend directly upon them, to a great many people who actually live in the region. The lake is not some historic mistake waiting to be undone. It is a vital and a deeply beloved resource to be protected at all costs. And so, in reality, the government today is doing almost the precise opposite of Mead First. In recent years, as the crisis has deepened, federal officials have actually chosen to prioritize keeping water inside Lake Powell, at times even deliberately holding water back from Lake Mead downstream, specifically in order to protect the Glen Canyon Dam and its all-important power generation. So, far from letting Glen Canyon return for good, the official strategy of the moment has been to try, as hard as possible, to keep it safely drowned. And here lies the truly bittersweet catch at the very heart of this entire story. The return of Glen Canyon, at least for now, is not remotely permanent. It exists entirely at the mercy of the water level. When a big snow year finally arrives, exactly as one did in 2023, when a heavy mountain snowpack sent a great surge of runoff pouring down into the reservoir, the lake rises up again, and the canyon simply drowns once more. The cathedral in the desert, which had so gloriously and completely reappeared, found itself partly reflooded all over again within just a matter of months. And so Glen Canyon today exists in a strange and haunting kind of limbo, breathing slowly in and out with the rhythm of the drought itself. It surfaces when the water drops, and it vanishes again when the water climbs. It is there, and then it is gone, and then it is there once again, a lost world quietly flickering at the very edge of return. So let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and with genuine balance, because it would be very easy indeed to tell this whole story as a simple, triumphant tale of nature beautifully healing itself, and there is real truth and real undeniable beauty in that version of it. What is happening down in Glen Canyon right now is genuinely remarkable. A drowned wilderness, given even the very smallest chance, is coming roaring back to life entirely on its own. But it is deeply important to hold the whole picture in view at once, because this canyon is only returning at all because the river itself is in crisis, because there is simply not enough water, and 40 million people downstream all depend upon that very same shrinking supply. The stunning beauty of the reviving canyon and the real fear of the deepening water shortage are two sides of the exact same coin. And the question of whether we should ever try to make that return permanent, whether to let Lake Powell go and restore Glen Canyon for good, is genuinely not a simple or an obvious one. It is a real and painful collision of deeply held values, a priceless natural and cultural wonder standing on the one side, and water security and electrical power, and the long-settled expectations of an entire region standing on the other. There is no easy answer to be found here, but there is, undeniably, something quietly powerful in simply watching it all happen, in seeing a place that the world had long ago written off as lost forever, patiently, stubbornly, insisting on coming back. So the next time that you happen to hear about Lake Powell and its steadily falling waters, I want you to remember that there are really two very different stories flowing through that same red canyon at the very same time. One of them is a story of loss and of crisis, a great reservoir shrinking away, a mighty river stretched far past its natural limit, a stark warning of harder and drier times still to come. but the other one is a story of return. Because down there, far beneath that retreating water line, the ferns are unfurling once again on the ancient red rock walls. The waterfall is falling, once more, into the heart of the cathedral in the desert. The river is quietly carving its old, forgotten path back through the stone. And a canyon that the entire world had truly believed it had drowned forever, more than 60 years ago, is now rising slowly and silently back up into the light, reminding us, perhaps, of something worth holding on to, that some of the places we are most certain we have lost may in fact only be waiting, with an almost infinite patience, for the water to fall, and for the smallest chance to simply begin again.